Hey everybody, this is Jennifer Schaus, and we are coming to you live today from Washington, D.C. in our sponsored content webinar series. Today we welcome C3 Integrated Solutions and Bill Wooten. Bill Wooten is a co-founder and chief revenue officer of C3 Integrated Solutions, a full-service IT provider that accelerates CMMC compliance by designing, implementing, and managing IT and cybersecurity solutions. Through its Steel Root platform, C3 delivers an expertly managed environment that brings together everything federal contractors require to confidently meet CMMC requirements. A graduate of Drexel University and Georgetown McDonough School of Business, Bill is passionate about bringing cyber awareness and maturity to the defense industrial base, working with clients to help them achieve CMMC and NIST 800-171 compliance. We're going to go ahead and get started now, and thanks, Bill, for joining us.
Thanks, Jennifer, for having us, and really looking forward to today. So as we get started, just kind of the quick preface, we know CMMC is upon us. It's there. The defense industry submitted the rule to OMB in late July. So we're all waiting on the clock, waiting for it to come out. I'm one of the few people that will tell you straight up, don't really know what's happening in terms of when and where and how it's going to happen, but we do know it's going to happen. It's very much a train that has left the station and is not going to stop. So as we move into kind of today's topics, what we're going to talk to is how do you build a strategy around CMMC? What are the drivers that are going to go into that strategy? And what are the cost factors that are going to be part of that as well? So as we go to the next slide, we're going to talk to the major components of the cost of CMMC. Obviously, there's building that strategy, that first piece. You can't build a house without a set of plans, without a place and an approach on how you're going to go ahead and go do that. Then we're going to talk about deploying that strategy. And as we know, compliance isn't a one-time event. It's an ongoing thing. It's a lifestyle. It's a continual piece. So there's a management, there's a monitoring cost component that goes into the CMMC approach. And then finally, there is the cost of compliance. Everything you do to provide operational excellence, a secure environment, there's going to be a third piece to that, which is the cost of actually maintaining the compliance of it. We're also going to talk a little bit about data enclaves. A lot of our clients, almost every client we talk to, at least explores the idea of, do you go all in or do you do a data enclave? And that's really where we're going to go into some of the cost profiles and show how some choices can be made based on who you are and where you're at. Now, this isn't a presentation where I'm going to say it costs X dollars for the Y size company, but we will explore some budgetary numbers in terms of how a data enclave influences your strategy and has an impact into your cost as well. So let's move on to that next piece, and let's talk a little bit about building a strategy. So when you build a CMMC strategy, there's several components to it that are going to drive which way you go. First of all, you need to understand your business, understand where you are from a market perspective and where you're going from a directional standpoint. What type of business are you pursuing? That type of knowledge is going to help you understand and set that system boundary. So now you can kind of put a box around where you're going to store, process, and transit CUI and where you're not going to have that information. Obviously, the smaller the system boundary, the smaller the profile, smaller attack surface, and hopefully a smaller cost profile, but not always the case. So we'll talk about that as we go on. Those things are going to determine your organizational impact. Who are the people? What are the processes that are impacted by your compliance strategy? And then ultimately, your knowledge of the first three pieces are going to determine the expertise that you need from an external standpoint to help you build that strategy. So the first step in this is going to be understanding your business. As we go to the next slide, there are really kind of two sides to this. There's the external and the internal side of this. The external kind of seem obvious, but we need to talk about it anyway. Who are your customers? What agencies are you working with? Are you working with something fairly low key with cost type work, or are you doing work like sensitive type stuff with, like, say, an Intel group or something like that? That's going to drive what your compliance profile looks like. who are your partners? Who are your primes? Who are your subs? In a lot of ways, the prime contractors, especially the bigger ones, are driving adoption with CMMC by enforcing some of the other DFARS clauses, like 70/20, with their questionnaires, with their requirements to have certain things in place to continue to do business with them. Obviously, you need to look at your contracts. What are the clauses that are already in your contracts? Do you have 70/12, 70/19, 20, 20/20, 70/24 now? Are those things in there? If you have 70/12 in your contracts, pretty safe bet that CMMC is eventually going to work its way in there as well. And then finally, as a business owner, you need to ask yourself, what's the future of your business? Where do you want to be in 2 or 3 years? Do you have an exit strategy? Are you trying to get bought? Are you trying to acquire companies? We talk to a lot of clients who have a solid business in, say, DHS or labor or energy and are planning to move in the DoD market within a couple of years. We always talk to them about how can they do this work up front to be ready when they start chasing those contracts. When we look internal to the organization, again, some of these things may seem obvious, but it's important to really think through them. Do you have CUI today? Do you have export controlled data? Ironically enough, not all CUI is export data, but it's important to know whether you have one or both of those. And just as important is, can you segment that from the rest of the business? When we explore some examples in a minute, you'll see what that means. Next is, who are the people that interact with that data? Who directly works with CUI, but also who indirectly works with CUI. A lot of times we'll find that contracts administrative people, subject matter experts, maybe business development people, all of a sudden need occasional access to that data that includes or may include CUI, and all of a sudden the number of people that have access to it double or triple when you don't even realize it. And then finally, of course, what systems are going to store, process, or transit that data? The better you know the answer to these questions, the less you're going to need to hire someone to go help you figure out that answer. So, as we walk through this presentation, we're going to go through 3 examples of a couple of firms. We've labeled them research, manufacturing, and pro services. Really, they could be interchangeable, but we're going to use that for the purpose of keeping them organized. Our first company is going to be a research firm that does mostly commercial work with a single DoD contract and a small team of people that work on that. We see this a lot with universities where they do a lot of work and they have 1 or 2 contracts to sit on the side that have a dedicated group, and it's very segmentable. Next up is the other end of that spectrum. We have a manufacturing firm where about 90% of their work does work with customized parts for aircraft and a large amount of export control data. We're going to see very clearly how that impacts their strategy in terms of approaching CMMC. And then finally, we have a professional services firm that frankly doesn't know. They have a lot of distributed contracts. Team members rotate in and out of different projects, centralized administrative support for all their services. Maybe they were a roll up of several companies, and it really kind of not a very clear understanding of those components there. For our reference and for our presentation today, we're going to assume all the current systems are not compliant, and there's no pre-existing certs like an ISO or something like that that would give you kind of a big leg up in your compliance approach. So when we look at these companies and we start looking at who they are, company 1, that research firm there, we're going to see as we click through, 90 of their 100 people work in the commercial space. They have 10 people working on 1 contract, very easily segmented from the rest of the organization. So that's one scenario on one end of the spectrum. In the next company, in our manufacturing option, we have the opposite profile. 90% of the firm works in areas and works with data that may be considered CUI or at least have access to it. Going to be a very different profile and approach. And then third, when we look at our professional services firm, we're not really sure. We don't know where all our data is. We're not sure which systems is it in. We're not even sure how many people have it. So we're going to take a very different approach with them as we look at what's the best strategy for them. So when we talk through the idea of a data enclave, we just kind of want to explain what that is as well. A data enclave is a separate environment. It's isolated from the corporate environment. It's literally, from an IT perspective, running a separate company from an IT standpoint. And it has a lot of advantages for companies, including reducing that investment scope, that smaller attack surface, more controlled system boundary. And in a lot of cases, there's very little, if any, data migration. But it also comes with challenges. Most of the time, almost always what we find is a user that is in the enclave stays in the commercial environment for other activities, even if they're just HR related. So we have this swivel seat effect where they've got to jump from one side to the other. In some cases, it feels like that's going to be a cheaper option, and then you get a little deeper into it and you're not entirely sure. And then there's the intangible components of this. There's the IT burden of administering two environments. There's also the idea of unintended spillage. That person who works in both environments needs to be clear to their external stakeholders where to send information, whether it goes to their corporate email or whether it goes to their GovCon or government contractor environment. Flip side of this, obviously, from a all-in perspective, the whole company goes in, move everyone into a single consolidated environment. Generally, this eliminates technical debt because you need to move your environment into a compliant environment. You need to have a system refresh. This can be a little more costly up front, but you get a better overall environment at the end of it. There is usually a data migration involved in this. So there's a higher user impact up front, higher deployment cost. And the other components, when we start talking about the intangibles that come with all in, is that generally everyone is in a lockdown state. So the ability to go out and get a new software, get something approved to work on your environment, those things start to have requirements and constrictions around them that maybe you didn't have before you took this approach. And that really shows up with being able to freely work with applications, or do you go through an approval process before you can start interacting with them? So when we go back to our clients here and our examples here, it becomes pretty clear. That company, first company, they're going to go with an enclave. Small group of people, isolatable, segmentable, very straightforward. Company two, the opposite approach. 90% of them are in. Everyone in the company touches CUI practically. They should go all in with everything. But that company three is where we're going to drill into a little later. We're going to talk a little bit about the different choices and where that inflection point becomes in terms of where you go from an data enclave standpoint. So, actually, yeah, there we go. Jennifer, you're joking with me there. You skipped one on me. Just kind of wrapping up this strategy component of it here. There, when we look at the drivers, the knowledge of your business, the data, the current situation, those internal resources, those all have implications on the cost side of it. And you need to think about that cost as well. Do you want to go hire an outside consultant? That third firm we just looked at probably does, because they need a lot of work just understanding what data they have and where they have it, and maybe mapping out their processes. But don't skip on the internal effort either. You're going to have to assign someone to do this work. If it's an IT person or a compliance person, they're probably already stretched pretty thin. Be aware of that internal burden that you're putting on them, even if it's not a hard dollar incremental cost. Look at also the indirect costs that come with building that strategy. What is the organizational impact? What business processes are changing? What is the impact on your business strategy? Are you going to make a conscious decision not to work with a partner or not to pursue certain business because of what you want to do with CMMC? Or maybe it opens up other opportunities to be more aggressive with things. And what's your confidence level when you look at this? If you're solid and you've got good folks who understand these things, then you have a lot of confidence. If not, and you're not certain on where you're going, it makes sense to have an outside voice in there to kind of give you some guidance. Remember, when we look back at the drivers as well, see that current situation and where you are with your current and technical environment. Have you made those investments? Have you built documentation already? Are all going to drive costs over the course of this whole piece there. It's also important to talk about the fact that strategy costs are not directly related to the size of the company. What it is the complexity of the challenge. You're going to give that outside consultant. How much of this is fairly easy and straightforward? How much of this is muddled, and they're going to have to do some work to help figure things out for you and give you some guidance. So now, as we start to talk a little bit on the deployment side and kind of what it means to kind of execute this strategy, the first thing we're going to look at is, how do we set a system boundary? What are the systems that are going to store, process, or transit CUI data? The obvious ones are usually email, communications, collaboration type systems, SharePoint, OneDrive, whatever you're using for your document management, those types of things. But you also need to look at your CRM systems, your financial systems. Do you have operational technology? Do any of those systems have CUI today? And can you isolate those systems from CUI? It's a lot easier if you can say, you know what, I'm not going to put a copy of contracts in my financial systems. I can get an opinion or an assessment that financials out of the picture. Again, lowers your system boundary, makes it easier to go and become compliant. Another key component on this is the access. A lot of companies who go to data enclave typically will choose a virtual desktop strategy. That way their users aren't carrying around 2 different laptops. But the physical devices will come into play depending on what your strategy is. And don't sleep on mobile devices as well. It's kind of a whole Pandora's box when you do data enclaves and how you manage your mobile devices there, that we could talk about in another time. All of these things are going to drive your system selection. There's always going to be a conversation around cloud versus on-prem. We all know today most folks are going to cloud, but it's worthy of at least making that a conscious decision. And then the other 2 big drivers become FedRAMP and export control. DFAR 7012 requires FedRAMP moderate equivalent, even though that was never really defined. We're starting to see other requirements leaked about, talked about, rumored about within these pieces there. But it's also a signal to you as a client. If your underlying provider has made a commitment to FedRAMP, they've made a commitment to the government business and more than likely to DoD standpoint. Same thing goes for export control. We could do a whole webinar. We've done full webinars on export control. Bottom line is you have to make sure that that vendor will attest to data residency and that they'll attest to only U.S. persons. Obviously, as we minimize this system boundary, it reduces what you need to do in order to be fully compliant. So we're going to talk a little bit about costs. We're going to use Microsoft 365 as an example, partially because it's really out there and apparent and everyone uses it, but also because it really clearly, they've done a great job of illustrating what the differences are here. The source on this is a public sector blog that they do from time to time, and it really highlights within the system selection criteria how important accreditations are, attestations are, and again, going back to that export control. We can see when we look across the 3 different versions of 365 in commercial, GCC, and GCC high, things shift and change a little bit. The data centers are worldwide with commercial. But as we skip down a little bit and we look at 7012 is really where we start to see the differences. Microsoft will attest to 7012 compliance, and specifically clauses C through G, in GCC and GCC high. They will not do it in commercial. So that's important. Your underlying vendor, Microsoft, will not attest to whether or not they will meet that requirement. Big decision in which way you go with your cloud. Same thing with ITAR in EAR. If we skip down and we look at the directory and the network and the customer support, those things are still worldwide with commercial and GCC. So Microsoft will not attest to anything that has data sovereignty in GCC or commercial. You have to go to GCC high there. What we've typically seen across various vendors is that most vendors that are committed, truly committed to this space, will have a version of GovCloud that is dedicated to meeting these requirements. And what we also will find is that there is a price premium for these services, a whole list of really good reasons behind that, but it's typically at least 30% higher. You see down on the bottom there some price examples for Microsoft 365, even a little more than that as you get into GCC high. So other things to be concerned about with deployment costs are things like provisioning, configuration, and data migration. Any vendor is going to charge you to actually establish the tenant, get it put in place, but more importantly, they're going to talk to you, and there's going to be a cost to configure that environment. Going back to the 365 example, a whole host of things where you turn things on or off or adjust them or tweak them and kind of configure them to get them aligned to NIST 171, which, as we know, is the basis of CMMC. Good vendors will give you a data output, a deliverable that is the documentation on what they've built and what they've delivered for you. Data migration really drives by the size of the company, as well as whether you're going into a data enclave. Some things are proportional. So again, using Microsoft 365 as an example, 50 people versus 500 people, you have that many more mailboxes, the cost is going to go up. Teams and SharePoint is usually driven by 2 other factors. One is how much data you have in there, as well as the complexity. Have you gone and built out a bunch of workflows or things like that that are going to drive up the complexity of the migration and therefore drive the cost of it as well. So We mentioned at the beginning of this, compliance isn't a destination. It's a thing. It's a way of life. It's ongoing. Delivering and provisioning a compliance system is the first step, and really only the first step. There is going to be ongoing management cost to run an environment in a compliant state. Now, whether we are looking at this as from an internal or an external standpoint, standard services, standard MSP services, and this really doesn't do it justice, but include things like system administration, operational monitoring, patch management, the support desk capability, fixing things, and then the overall maintenance and health of the environment, typical moves, adds, changes, little projects, adding systems, adding users, provisioning, recovering devices, all kind of standard from an IT services standpoint. But when we start looking at that and we take that to the next step and we start talking about what does a compliant management service look like, again, whether that's MSP driven or internal, there's a whole layer of things that now need to be done in order to maintain compliance. It starts with documentation. Do you have an SLA? Do you have a shared resource model matrix, especially as an external vendor? You know, there are 320 assessment objectives. You should be able to sit down with your vendors and be able to know which ones are you doing, which ones are they taking responsibility for, and how do you share that responsibility across the life cycle of that environment. Things like standardized procedures, configuration updates, regular system reviews are all part of the requirements to be compliant, and therefore whoever is managing your IT needs to be able to bring those to the party and support you, either enabling you to do them or making sure they're taking care of those for you as well. Most cases now you will have a GRC tool, effectively a tool that captures everything that you're doing to maintain compliance. The days of doing this in an Excel spreadsheet are pretty much gone. Most folks are buying a third-party tool to capture that information. That should be part of the conversation with who's managing your environment. And then, of course, how are they going to support you during the assessment? Is it going to be project-based? Is it built into their process? Have they gone through assessments? Do they know what that experience is going to look like? Our expectation is generally we're sitting alongside the client and we're probably going to answer 65% of the questions from an assessor when we work with them, because we know that we're managing the majority of their environment for them. The critical piece of this, going back to that export piece, if you have export control data or have data sovereignty requirements, make sure that provider is US based. You know, putting your NOC in a third party country, other things like that, those things are, you know, don't work for companies that have export control. If you're not able to support these things, look for a vendor that specializes in the DIB, that has done the work to rebuild their systems and make sure that they can handle these requirements. So, monitoring. It's not just about managing your environment. Now we all need to monitor as well. You need to actively monitor it. MSSP is all the rage right now. There's dozens, if not hundreds of companies providing that service. It's important to know that it is a very cluttered field right now. The costs vary very much so depending on what services are being delivered, and it's really hard to work through the marketing language to be able to understand what's going on. Things that you want to look for are, what level of automation do they do? There's a lot of great work that's done to help filter out the noise from your signals, but do they still have what they call eyes on glass and people, actually live people that are responding to alerts? Can they support that export control requirement? Again, hold Pandora's box there, but there's very few MSSPs now that can actually support that, or that will come out and attest to that. Are they 24/7? Do they have the documentation? Are they able to provide you that same SLA, shared responsibility matrix? Do they have an IR plan that they can support and give to you as a template in order to help you do everything you need to be ready when that assessment comes around? And are they going to sit alongside you when through the portions of it that are relevant to their piece? Do they have an incident response plan? What certifications do they have? And do they have other ancillary services like vulnerability scanning, penetration testing, things like that as well? Now, the last piece of our component is compliance, and there is a cost of managing compliance. As I mentioned earlier, you can build operational excellence in delivering services to your users. You can do everything you need to secure that environment, but there will be a third component of it, which is just doing the administrative side of cost. There are really two sides to this. There's initial cost as well as ongoing cost. Initial cost is what it's going to take to get you up and running and get you to that threshold where you're in a compliant state. The pre-assessment review, doing the documentation development, the SSP, the policies, procedures, all of that. We also recommend at some point in the process doing an initial assessment. You may want to do this on day one if you've done the hard work and you feel really confident and you have, again, maybe an ISO certification, you know you've got a small task list to do. You may want to wait until later on in the process where you've deployed enough stuff that it makes sense to get value out of that. And one of the things that we do recommend as you get close to an assessment is an initial tabletop exercise. Walk through all of the assessment objectives with all of the partners that you're there, both internal and external, and make sure you know who is going to be answering each assessment objective, who's going to be providing that artifact, and that will help you build that poem on the things you need to do to be truly ready for an assessment. This is also an ongoing cost component as well. That documentation, that GRC tool, keeping it alive, keeping it fed, keeping it consistent and up to date takes an amount of effort, takes some care and maintenance. There are annual validations that are going to be part of CMMC, whether that's internal, self-attestations in between the individual outside assessments, or you may want to also do tabletops to manage your own compliance drift as well. And then finally, ad hoc consulting. There will be questions that come up. Someone's going to ask if they can use a new software, and you need to know, does it work? Can you allow it to have CUI data? You're going to get a contract that's going to get language in it that isn't straightforward, and you're going to need to ask it. Vendors, primes, they're going to give you questionnaires that are going to be painful and difficult, and you're going to want help filling those out to make sure that you're doing that in a smart manner, in an accurate manner. It's also important to understand that compliance costs are going to have a minimum threshold. These things need to be done, no matter a minimum amount of it needs to be done, no matter how small or big you are. And it's hard to get an economy of scale until you get up into probably 100 users or even higher in terms of being able to be a little more proportional in the increased effort versus the increased cost as well. So now we're going to take a minute, we're going to bounce back into our examples, and we're going to kind of talk through a little bit about where they're going to go through each one of them. In order to do this, we're going to take a snapshot of what cost profile looks like for an organization. We only have 45 minutes. We can't cover everything. So what we're going to simply look at is the differences between a commercial and a GCC high environment. We're going to take some sample costs for IT monitoring cost. We're going to assume those users are swivel seat where there is a data enclave. That means they are still provisioned and active in both environments, which means we have to double count across both environments when we start talking about the enclave. Now, these numbers are not gospel, and the 365 number is pretty close. IT support and monitoring, these are sample. Don't go running to your budget people. Don't go running to your IT people and ask them why the costs are above or below that. These are meant to be illustrative purposes and also show that increase between the corporate environment and the government environment and the cost of operating those components. Now, we've not considered additional applications in this. We're not considering the intangibles, that user frustration, the overhead of managing multiple environments. Those are real, but again, we only have 45 minutes. So we're also not talking about strategy and deployment costs in here. We just want to show a snapshot to show how these things shift depending on the strategy you go for. So let's start with the pre-budget, and we're going to just kind of look at as a baseline in this next slide what this company, these example companies go through day one, starting through, and it'll show up in the details on this next slide, where we're going to show the Microsoft 365 cost, the IT support, and the monitoring. So next slide, Jennifer. Great. So in this example, again, we're using commercial environment, 365, G5 licenses. We're taking our reference costs for IT support. It doesn't matter if this is internal or external. It's about kind of having a budgetary number and a dollars per user type of rate. So as you get to that effective number, that's what we're putting in as a placeholder here. And the monitoring, we're using the commercial grade of that. And again, assuming all 100 users have a laptop, gets to an annual budget of just around $280,000. And you can see the breakdown as you go through the 3 different layers there on the graph itself. So when we look at our first firm in this next slide here, company 1, the research firm, we're going to show how the data enclave impacts their budget. So again, here we're taking 10 users, putting them in the GCC high. In this case, we're using Azure Virtual Desktop for user access. So there's no additional applications available, but there's no additional endpoints either. We're not buying laptops for these folks. We're going to let them use Azure Virtual Desktop. We're taking a factor of $2,000 a month in terms of Azure usage. Your cost will vary. It is very much a consumption piece, but we need to put a placeholder in here to show it. And then as we see there, we're going from that $280,000-ish budget up to about a little over $340,000, showing the difference of that investment in the data enclave with those 10 users. It's important to know that those costs are proportional. So if you don't have the adoption, you're still probably paying for those licenses because there's probably going to be a minimum level you buy. And as you add people, there will be an incremental cost for each person based on licenses, based on the IT support, based on the consumption around Azure as well. Now, when we take the other extreme in the next slide here at our second company here, the manufacturing firm, they've gone the other direction. They've said, okay, we're going to go all in, 100 users, GCC high. We're not going to use Azure Virtual Desktop because we're going to convert our endpoints. We're going to use that higher number for IT support because there's additional requirements there, as well as with monitoring. And again, we're not considering the deployment cost in here, but the budget, the operating budget itself is going to bump up to about $400,000, driven in large part because of the licensing, but also the additional cost to support that in a compliant manner itself. So as we move into the third company, this is the one where it gets interesting. So remember, we have a situation here now where we have 100 people. We don't really know how many people are going to cover and work on CUI. We're not sure where all our data is. We may likely spend a lot of money with a consultant to figure out all of that. And you're still going to need to make that choice. Do we go all in? Do we go with a data enclave? And what we're showing here is that there is an escalating commitment as more and more users are added to that enclave. So looking at the graph here, that baseline, that dark blue is what that baseline budget was. And then when we look at the incremental costs as we add users, that lighter blue, as we add more and more people, we add more and more cost to the data enclave as part of your operating environment. We just saw in the last slide what the all-in cost was, which was just about $400,000. So the important part here is recognizing that there will be an inflection point. In this case, it's just under 30 users. It's going to be somewhere between 25 and 35, most likely, depending on what your numbers are, where you hit an inflection point where those simple operational costs actually become more expensive than just going all in. And that's a key understanding when you're starting to make that consideration. It might actually make things easier on the front end of it, because if you don't have to specifically sort out every file and every data and every folder, and you decide to go all in, you might not be as worried about where all that data is within your system itself. So it's important to kind of think about the end result while you're working on that beginning piece. Once again, all the caveats apply here. We're not talking about that increased risk of unintended spillage. It's easy to have 5 or 6 people be really careful about where the data is held in which environment. A little harder with 15, a little harder with 30, much harder with 50 or 60 people. That risk goes up with every additional user you put into an enclave. And there is a frustration level. People get frustrated when they've got to jump from system to system. If they can work for a dedicated amount of time in each system and minimize those transfers, not so bad. If they're flipping back and forth several times a day, that frustration level is going to happen. Okay, great. We're kicking along at a really good pace here. I want to wrap up just talking about us. Talk a little bit about us at C3 Integrated Solutions. We've been a Microsoft partner for well over 11 years now. Almost half of that has been in the GCC High space. We were one of the first 5 companies in the AOSG partner program, being able to transact, sell, deploy, and manage GCC High. That gives us a very, very deep experience with working with clients, especially in the defense industrial base. We understand NIST, DFARS, and ITAR because we've been there. We've been there for a long time now. We understand what the impacts are, both to our clients and how we run our business internally as well. We have well over 450 clients under management in Microsoft 365. Almost half of those now are in GCC High. So again, a broad range of experience, not just commercial, not just GCC, but of course GCC High itself. We like to think of ourselves as an industry leader. We've been really early in things like offering hosted voice in GCC High and working with vendors to enable those services in GCC High. We are a registered practitioner organization. We do participate in the ecosystem. And if you follow CMMC, there's right about 50 C3PAO companies that have passed the DIBCAC and have been authorized to go ahead and start doing the voluntary assessments. 2 of those are our clients. We've been through it. We understand what that process is going to look like. We've sat next to our clients, answered those questions, provided the artifacts for our clients on behalf of them for those DIBCAC audits. Within our product solution set, we don't have a slide on this now, but our Steel Root compliance program and technology platform are specifically designed to help you deploy a compliant environment, provide the level of management to stay and maintain compliance, and then offer that advisory services around compliance. In our compliance program, we support as much as 80% of the assessment objectives that you're going to have to answer as part of NIST 800-171 and CMMC. Now, there's always going to be things we don't do, things like background checks and physical security. There's going to be a few things that we can coach you through and help you get you through, but being able to handle the technical requirements around that, covering 80%, is a big step forward to helping clients quickly and effectively get to their CMMC compliance. So, Jennifer, we're at 12:35. I know we have about 5-10 minutes left or so. Do we have any questions?
Yes, we do. First of all, thanks, Bill, for a great presentation. I was taking some notes myself, so sorry for any delay on the advancement of slides. Everything is being recorded, and the recording will be posted to our YouTube channel later this afternoon. The slides will be available on slideshare.net. And when I say our YouTube channel, I'm talking Jennifer Schaus and Associates. So we do have a couple questions that have come in here. So let me just read them in the order that they came in. And I'll just throw this out there to all of the attendees and audience. You can type your questions in to the question section, not the chat section. We will not read your name. So don't be shy about asking any questions. Our first one reads, what should we look for in a consultant to help build our CMMC strategy?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different things to look at. If you go back to the early beginning of the PowerPoint, understanding what your requirements are and talking about those couple of slides there about knowing your business, knowing where your data is, knowing where your contracts are, the level of confidence you have there will start to influence what you're looking for. We have clients that spend a tremendous amount of energy and needed and required helping them just understand where their data is and where it is in their contracts. We have also folks that have a really high degree of confidence on that, but want that kind of vote of confidence that they're going in the right direction and kind of need a lower level of support. In terms of the folks out there, there is a full ecosystem out there. The Cyber AB has a long list of providers out there, and you want to think about who's the right fit for your organization. There are large financial consulting firms that do an amazing job and have very deep, complex programs that work well, frankly, for larger organizations. And there's a lot of smaller firms, sometimes as little as 2 or 3 people, that do great work and fit themselves and really tailored for those smaller businesses without all the extra weight that comes with a big professional organization.
Okay, great. And another question here is, what type of timeline should we allow from start to finish?
Yep. So there's a little bit of variability in here, obviously based on the size and the complexity. We generally recommend at least 6 months, possibly as many as 12, to really get to a compliant state and be ready for an assessment. Now, what that means is you're going to take 3 or 4 months probably to put a strategy together, select vendors, and actually start the work itself. You're going to take another 3 to 5, maybe 6 months, putting that strategy in place, deploying the technologies, getting it operational, and then working out things. Nothing's perfect the day you turn the key on it. There'll be some stuff that you need to build operational knowledge on. Even when you're working with an experienced vendor like ourselves, there's a little bit of a working out period as you start to get comfortable with things like what's the approval process, things like that for various changes in your environment. At that point, those last 3 months become, what's your pre-gap assessment? What's your tabletop? How do I make sure that I'm knocking things off that are identified as weaknesses or maybe can be are gaps in what you've done? So those 12 months go really quickly. It's not unheard of for clients to need longer than that to be fully ready for an assessment.
Great. And is CMMC just for Department of Defense contractors?
Yes, there's a lot of stuff going on there's expectations out there, and none of this is really kind of out, but there's an expectation that the FAR is going to get adjusted. NIST is going through its revision. We're seeing NIST 800-171 independent of CMMC. We're seeing that in contracts with other agencies like state and EPA, and some other agencies there where they're, ironically enough, they're requiring NIST 800-171. We could do a whole webinar on Rev 3. We've done webinars on Rev 3 and what those changes are going to be. But in terms of CMMC and that formal system of a third-party assessment, that's limited to DoD. But it's important to know that NIST 800-171 Rev 3, when it comes out, probably sometime in the next 12 to 18 months, will require an independent assessment. It's just ambiguous as to how to make that happen.
Great. And what if I am a subcontractor? Does CMMC apply to me?
If you are storing, transiting, or processing CUI data, absolutely. Clause 7020 requires prime contractors to validate the security of their subcontractors. Whoever the prime is needs to reach out to you and say, I need you to validate your security. There's a range of things that are entailed with that. Some companies are asking for a screenshot of your SPRS score. Other companies are putting very detailed requirements, very detailed questionnaires. In some cases, we've seen on certain programs, they're mandating using things like GCCI. So it's really dependent on who your prime is and what their working relationship is and what the nature of your contract is as well.
Great, and we still have a couple more questions that are filtering in, so I'm just going to read them in the order that they have arrived here into the inbox. My employer has been dabbling with federal opportunities. They don't want to focus on CMMC right now because we don't have any government contracts. If we want to get into the government sector, at what point should we start addressing CMMC?
So making the assumption that those contracts are DoD, that's where CMMC comes into place. There's a couple of different approaches on this. If you have a strategy that says, I want to pursue DoD contracts in 12 or 24 months, again, timeline to get there starts now to be ready. That first contract is going to require you to have an SPRS score. A year from now, we could very well be in a totally different place around assessments. The other approach on this is, like, while CMMC is your destination, sit down and have a meeting with a firm like ours right now. Let's talk about what your environment looks like today and where you can make incremental investments along the way. So when you get to that pivot point, you've already done a third or half or maybe even 3/4 of the work to get there. But the investments you'll make on day one are about improving your operational excellence, improving the security of your environment. They will go a long way to a better organization, as well as get you closer to being able to make an easier decision on pursuing those DoD contracts.
Great. If you have a facilities clearance, do you also need CMMC?
Yes, CMMC is entirely on the unclassed side of the house. It's totally different environment data. Everything is they think of them as parallel programs, or I wouldn't call them complementary. Parallel is probably the best word.
Do foreign companies also need to get certified on CMMC?
Yeah, so that's a question for the Cyber AB board. What we do see is, in most cases, a foreign company will build a U.S. subsidiary, and then they'll pursue CMMC in that strategy. There are some open questions around foreign involvement in CMMC that, again, I'll defer more to our friends over at the Cyber AB board.
And what do you see as the biggest hurdle for companies that are pursuing CMMC?
Commitment. It's about kind of, we used to talk about the stages of grief in CMMC, the denial, the arguing, the negotiating, and finally the acceptance of recognizing that this is here. It's about taking that step forward, making the commitment both financially, but also culturally, that you're going to run an environment in a secure way that also is going to meet compliance requirements.
Great. And will all defense contracts require CMMC, and if so, by what date?
Yeah, those are. I wish I had those questions. I'd be a lot richer than I am right now. So it's unclear at this point. I'll address the population. There was a unintended release of a couple of documents about a month ago that kind of gave some insight on the federal thinking around the size of the market. The expectation right now is there's somewhere around 300,000 total companies in the defense industrial base, and that about 80,000 of those are going to need formal CMMC acceptance. We believe that's probably a little bit undersold because there are companies that will go and get that even if they don't immediately need it. We also think the primes are going to put a lot of pressure on their subs, and some folks may go and make that investment in order to maintain their relationships and the opportunity to go do things with their primes as well. In terms of timing, that's the part I opened up with. Like, we don't know what's happening. We know there's a 90-day clock on the rule that was submitted to OMB. They can extend it for up to 30 days. They could send it back to the DoD. And then once that next phase, that next milestone hits, we'll have a little more clarity on where we want to go. There's a whole echo chamber on LinkedIn and Reddit and every other place that will give you a ton of opinions on it. But from what we can tell, we're all just kind of waiting. There's a pretty good consensus, though, that CMMC somewhere in the next 12 to 24 months will be actively in contracts, though.
Great. And does CMMC apply to commercial off-the-shelf products only?
Yeah, so I'll defer that technically to the DoD and the Cyber AB. As a broad sense, the general comment is if you're selling pizzas to the Pentagon, probably not. But if you're doing anything to modify that commercially off-the-shelf equipment for DoD specifications, you start pretty quickly getting into a situation where it may impact you. But that is actually one of those areas where that consultant that I mentioned, building that strategy, that's where they're going to earn their money, is being able to evaluate what your solutions are, what your contracts are, what you're delivering, and be able to give you a real answer to that question. It's really not a clear-cut answer.
At what point should companies start talking to you at C3?
12:45, I'd say about by 1 o'clock. What's up? So the urgency is there. Again, if you're doing work with the DoD, all the DFARS clauses already apply to you. You should have been doing DFARS 7012 for 5-6 years now at this point. If you're even considering and really at day one and just thinking about what to do it, give us a call. There's a small group that are really dedicated to this ecosystem. We are one of those. We'll talk to you about bigger picture things, help you figure out where you want to go, even if you're not looking to make a decision for 6 or 9 months. Let's just talk about that timeline. And then when you get to your budget cycles, you'll actually be able to have real data to put in there. We've seen this for 5 years now. People come, build a strategy, they'll put it on a shelf, and they'll call us back 6 months later when the budget's been approved. And they're like, hey, I'm ready to go forward now. That's fine. That's actually healthy. It's a good thing. And we will embrace that with you, because we'd rather you be making intelligent decisions that are educated than kind of guessing where the numbers are and then finding yourself really short.
Great. And anything else that you would like to add, Bill?
Jennifer, as always, thank you. Thank you for your support. Thank you for giving us this forum to talk to folks. Really appreciate everyone who signed up and stayed with us today. And again, please feel free to reach out and contact us. c3isit.com, or you have my email there in the bottom.
Yeah, this was great, and I appreciate the fact that you took the Q&A. If anybody has any other questions, please feel free to type them in. I'm happy to continue to read them off. The slides will be posted on slideshare.net. In fact, they may already be there. You can log into slideshare.net with your LinkedIn credentials. It doesn't cost you anything. And the webinar is being recorded. This should be posted later this afternoon to our YouTube channel. And if anybody had signed up for the webinar, you'll get an email with the link. So again, thanks so much, Bill, for excellent content as usual. I highly encourage everybody to reach out to Bill directly here using this email to get help, to answer any questions about CMMC that you didn't want to type in, and just to start the conversation. It's never too early. So again, you've got the website here for C3. We'll send the slides out and the link to the recording. And Bill, I'll give you any last words that you want to share.
I'm all good. Thanks, Jennifer.
Okay, thanks, Bill, and thanks everybody for joining us today.